Hello and welcome back to Tentatively Titled. Today we're going to be looking at the Kaba Simplex 900 again. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how you can get the combination if you only have access to the outside of the door, so none of these internals. All you have are these 5 buttons and this latch. So to start things off, let's take a look at what's happening on the inside of this lock. So this is the code block that we looked at before. You remember the 5 code wheels and then the corresponding finger plate. So we saw how when we input the correct combination, in this case, I believe it is that and then that, we turn the latch and we can see the finger plate entering those gates. And then when it goes all the way through, it'll clear the lock. But it's the entering of the gates that allows this front plate to turn and is what causes the latch to retract or the deadbolt to retract, depending on which one you're using. So the thing to look at here is how we can extract some information about this lock. So we're going to be using here what we call the tentative method. The tentative method is basically a method for altering the internal state of a lock. But enough of that background. Let's get into how this is going to work on this lock. So we only have one way to alter the internal state of the lock, and that is through pushing these buttons. And we have one way to feel the lock, and that is to turn this latch, and or we have one way to open the lock, which is to turn the latch, and we're going to feel the feedback by turning the latch and pushing buttons. So the way that's going to work is, as I turn this latch, you can see the finger plate slides, and it stops when it hits one of the code wheels. So if you get in there nice and close, because I already have 3 code wheels already set to the correct combination, or the correct position, clearly it's not hitting on those. So it's hitting on either this 3rd wheel or this 4th wheel, which are 2 and 3. And when I go to push 2, it drags, and I've partially pushed it, you can see, but it hasn't snapped back. And when I release the pressure, then it snaps back. So I can partially push it, and it's sticky, and it snaps back. But when I push on 3, 3 just snaps back on its own. And so what I'm feeling here is that sort of grinding and that sticking. That is that finger pushing on that code wheel and causing that code wheel to bind. So you can see that. It's very grindy, and then it will snap back when I let off the tension. The important thing is it's only binding on that. It's not binding on 3, and clearly it's not binding on these other ones. So I push it all the way. Now when I press on 3, 3's also got this sort of grinding. Let's see if we can see that a little better. Yeah. So I'm pushing lightly, it doesn't want to move, and then all of a sudden it'll pop as I overcome that friction. Sometimes it's grinding, there's a little bit of slipping. If I put more pressure, then it becomes more of a pop. But you can see there's a pretty simple method here where you push the plate forward, it sticks. You let off, it comes back out, and you can feel some grinding action there. And then when I get that in the correct position, you can feel grinding action on 3. Now the important thing to notice here is that 3 doesn't stick originally, but it does stick once I've turned 2. So if I only have access to the outside of the lock, when 3 all of a sudden starts sticking, that to me says, okay, pushing 2 allowed the finger plate to slide up, closing that gap and causing the finger plate to stop on 3 instead of stopping on 2, which means that pushing 2 must have caused it to rotate so that the gate is aligned with the finger pins. And if you really look in there, you can see that these finger pins have gone, or these fingers have gone quite deep at this point. So I can't push 1 at all. I can't push, or well, that's 1, I can't push 5. 2's already been pressed, and I can still push 4. So if we look at this, by feeling 1, I feel this very hard stop that I can't overcome. And that to me says 1 isn't in the combination because it's already in the correct position. It's so hard to move, the only way I could achieve that state is if 1 were already in the correct position so that that finger entered the gate so much that it can't rotate. Same thing happens with 5 over here. But, as you saw before, 4 can still rotate, even though it's already in the correct position. So this isn't a negative test or anything like that. It simply tells you if they happen to line up, that certain numbers aren't in the combination, but the fact that they don't do this sort of binding doesn't mean that they are in the combination. So the finger plate, again, has some contact with that wheel, but that contact simply causes the wheel to drag. So as we try to rotate the wheel, the finger plate pushes back. And we'll feel that as drag or stickiness on the lock. And I'll refer to this as hard, and I'll refer to this as a soft bind. And the difference between the two is pretty important. Now I know I kind of just explained that when we were looking at the lock, but there is one more sort of edge case I'd like to explain that I like to call sort of a pseudo soft bind or a hidden hard bind. Big fan of that alliteration. So imagine we have a code wheel that's set in the correct position. And here's the finger plate. So that's going up there. And then sort of further down here, we have a wheel that's in the incorrect position. And its finger plate is making full contact. So now we have a soft bind on what we'll call 2, and 1 has no bind at all because 2 is stopping the finger plate before it can enter 1. So if we try to push on 1, there'll be no resistance at all. Now if the finger plate here were just a little bit longer, we could get some resistance. Now, talking about longer and shorter finger pins might seem incomplete. So here we're just going to model all of the behavior in the lock as longer and shorter fingers. There's definitely other sorts of effects we could get. We could have incorrect positioning of the code wheels. So, one of them is very much out of place. We could have code wheels of different thicknesses. And we could have, again, longer or shorter fingers, all attached to that, that whole finger plate. I'm just going to stick to talking about longer fingers here because these other effects, the out of position, the different heights, stuff like that, those will all basically behave the same way as if the finger were longer. So we're just going to kind of lump that in and assume that everything's in the correct position, assume that everything's the same height, and then we'll treat any differences or any inaccuracies there as just differences in length of the fingers. So here we're talking about a finger that's partially entering a 0 turn wheel. So when we zoom in on that, sort of blow this out here, what we're going to get is that corner, and that corner's got some radius to it. And then we have this other corner. So they're going to come in contact, but that's going to force the code wheel up. It's going to force the finger pin down. That they're going to sort of have this normal interaction, along the radius of those, or along the radial lines of those fillets. And you know, this will be code wheel 1, so I'll just color that in a little. So what that's going to do is it's going to feel like a soft bind because it's not going to be deep enough to get that hard bind, and it's going to have that grinding as soon as it starts to push the finger plate back down. But the reason I'm calling this, you know, a pseudo soft bind or something like that is because it feels like a soft bind, but what this is a very shallow hard bind. And the way you distinguish this from a true hard bind and a true soft bind is that in the soft bind, you know, if we're soft binding on 2, it'll feel like we're soft binding on 2, and it'll also feel like we're soft binding on 1. If we press 2, we should suddenly jump to a hard bind on 1. And if we press 1, this will actually force this plate back, and we will probably lose our soft bind on 2. So that'll feel different than a normal soft bind and a normal hard bind. Now, having gotten the explanation of soft and hard binds, I'd like to explain to you a little of how this attack is going to actually work. More than just the first initial press. What we're looking for here is, right now I'm feeling this drag on 2. The way I can tell what position 2 is if I push on it, and then the drag, and then I feel again for a drag in a different spot. I sort of touched on this before, but I want to make that a little more clear. Right now I feel no resistance on 3. I do feel resistance on 2. I know that if I lose that resistance on 2, well, I can't check again for resistance on 2 once I've turned it, right? So I can't check if it's hard binding or soft binding once I've pushed it. But what I can check is whether or not we now have resistance or that dragging on another code wheel. And if we do, that means that we're no longer dragging on 2. There's some springiness to the steel, there's some springiness to the code wheels and all that. It is definitely possible to bind on 2 wheels at once, but it's stiff enough, and if you control your force well enough, binding on 2 wheels at once is pretty rare. So we're going to kind of ignore that case for now, and see if we can't figure out how to crack an actual lock. Let's get down to the core of what this video is about, attacking this lock. So all we have access to here, remember, is these 5 buttons and this latch. The only way we have to know if we got the door open, well, is that the latch will retract and this knob will turn all the way. So let's look at some of our tools here. Again, this is what we have access to in the lock, but we'll bring along some pen and paper to keep track of what we're doing in the attack. So here, these columns are representing number of turns, and these rows are representing the button that we're pushing. So I'm going to be talking about the concept of a press. A press is when we push one or more buttons. So a press can be us pushing 2 buttons at once. I'll just call that one press, or I'll refer to that as a double press. Could be pushing 3. It's all more or less the same thing. The ability to push multiple buttons simultaneously does certainly complicate things a lot. But here we're going to be keeping track of turns. So a turn is whenever the code wheel rotates. So you get a turn when you include a certain button in a press. You also get it if you've pressed it before and you push a button afterwards. So these are sort of the terms I'm going to be using to describe this as we attack the lock and as we fill up this chart. Okay, so I could go on explaining more and more, but I'm sure that's getting boring, and let's just learn by doing. So first thing I'm going to do, clear the lock, make sure everything's in a nice neutral state. And then I'm going to just get a feel for these buttons. They all feel nice and springy, so nothing bad. That doesn't feel like there's any debris or anything's dragging already. And then I'm going to apply tension and feel out the lock again. So right away, one doesn't want to turn, or one doesn't want to push. When I push on it, you hear that pop as it sort of pops in. It's not a full click, that's not an actual press. It's just that sort of initial half movement. And when I let go, you'll hear it pop back. And I can repeat that behavior. So that's telling me I'm definitely not doing a full push. And 1 is definitely binding. 2's not, 3's not, 4's not, 5's not. So I'm going to say that 1 is a soft bind. And I'll just keep track of that here. 1, so we'll call it, well, let's say that when there are no presses, 1 soft binds. So that to me is just saying that 1 is definitely a soft bind, because if it were a hard bind, I wouldn't really be able to push it. If it were one of those fake hard binds, I'd feel something else binding as well. So that tells me for sure that 1 is part of the combination. So I know it's not turned 0 times. This is sort of going to be our marker for, is a button part of the combination at all? And how I know that it's got to be turned more than 0 times. So next step is to figure out how many times it gets turned. So I'll do that by pressing 1, and then I'll press 2. And now 1 has turned twice. And I'll see if anything sticks. Nah, 3 feels springy, 4 feels springy, 5 feels springy. Okay. I'll clear that, and I'll try 1 and then 5, just in case rotating 2 was causing the lock to bind on 2. I want to make sure that that isn't happening, so now I can feel that out again. And if I wanted to be complete, I guess I could go through and do 1 and 3, 4, or 1 and 4, but I'm going to call that good enough for now. It's not so bad when you're only doing 2 presses, but it gets very complicated when you're doing 3 or 4. So 1 definitely isn't turned once. And now we have to see if it's turned more times. So the next step would do 1, 2, 3. You can already see now we're only down to 2 possible buttons that we could feel anything on, and 2 that could be confounding our data. So it's not great, and we'll probably want to do some more redundancy here. So let's check. 4 feels springy. 5 is feeling sticky. Okay, so sorry, I should have X'd this out earlier. So this is 3. So 1, 2, 3 means 1 is turned once, 2 is turned twice, 3 is turned once, and now 5 is sticking. So we'll want to note that 1, 2, 3 gives us 5. I'd say that's probably a soft bind. But you know, I won't ever hold a bunch of confidence in these binds unless it's very clearly a hard bind. So soft is always comes with an asterisk. So that feels like 1 is in fact turned 3 times. So I don't need to do the redundancy that I did before here. The reason why is that I got a positive result. I found out something else was binding. The reason you need redundancy when you don't get that extra bind is because you could be hiding the bind in one of the buttons you already pushed. So if I didn't get that bind on 5, I wouldn't know if instead, oh, okay, now I'm binding on 3 or now I'm binding on 2, having rotated them. So 1 is turned 3 times, and I can knock these out. So I know I said I was going to just go at this lock, but I want to talk for a second about, big surprise, about what's going on in this top row and sort of what this means. So we now know that 1 is turned exactly 3 times. We don't know if anything else is turned along with it. Note that the rest of this column is still blank. 5 is probably in the lock. We did get a soft bind on it. But right now, we know that there are at least 3 turns in this combination, or at least 3 presses, because 1 gets 3 turns. And we know that 1 is part of that combination, and we know where 1 is. So that's actually drastically cutting down on our code space. And what we'll probably see as we attack this lock is we reach a point where our attacks get complex, but our code space gets very small, and we can just brute force the whole thing. Brute forcing an entire lock from scratch with no information is pretty slow and really easy to mess up. But once we start giving even small amounts of information like this, we are knocking out literally hundreds of possible combinations. So it gets much smaller very quickly. So tangents aside, 5 was our last bind, so we're going to see if we can get any information out of 5. Yeah, let's see if we can figure out where 5 goes. So let's try, say 5 is definitely in the combination. Might take that back, but let's just try 5, 1, 2, 5. So 5 is turned once, 2 is turned twice, 1 is turned 3 times. And, well, 3's definitely got a little bit of a bind there. And 4 is also feeling a little bit of drag. Not quite sure what's going on with those two, but definitely could be something there. Let's check a little more. So let's do 1, 3, 5. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that those two were binding. Is pretty soft. So I'm just checking a little redundancy. Okay, 1, 3, 5. Yeah, again, I'm feeling a little bit of binding on 4, and I'll just check 1, 4, 5. Oh yeah, definitely feeling some binding on 3. And so that's making me think that 5 is probably turned once. Let's turn it twice and see what happens. Yeah, so that's a totally different feeling in the lock. Everything felt way springier. So I'm going to say that 5 definitely gets turned just once. So now again, if you'll permit a little tangent, we know exactly where 5 is, and we know exactly where 1 is. There's actually very little left combination-wise. So we are already cutting down the code space pretty dramatically. But we can always cut it down even further. So we're going to continue onwards and see what else we can get. So I just wanted to do this quick little sketch to just remind us what we're doing and sort of things that we're looking at. So it is possible that we have the situation where we still have an unused code wheel, but we can't see it yet because it's not, that finger's not entering, because we're still bound up on another wheel that isn't correctly positioned yet. So just because we have this doesn't mean that there isn't something still bound up in here, or something still hidden in here that we're not using. But we are definitely using one of these wheels because something has to go in this 2 slot. So let's proceed and use the information that we have to see if we can figure out a little more about the lock. So let's try 1, 2, 5. Little binding on 3. Little binding on 4. That's interesting. So 1, 2, 5. 3's got a bind and 4's got a bind. kind of hard to tell what kind. 1, 3, 5. No bind on 2. Still bind on 4. So 1, 3, 5. Still get a bind on 4. And 1, 4, 5. Nothing on 2 again. And definitely a bind on 3. All right, so this is interesting. When we press 3, we get a bind on 4. When we press 4, we get a bind on 3. When we press 2, we get a bit of a bind on both of them. So it looks kind of like we're running into one of these where sort of both wheels are about, or both fingers are about the same length, and it's just sharing the load in between. There's a little bit of play in it, but you know, like I said, there's a little bit of springiness in these wheels, and if you push hard enough, you can definitely get 2 simultaneous binds. So my guess would be that 3 and 4 are both part of the combination. Certainly possible that we have some soft binds here, but why not try them and figure out? Worth noting is that it looks like each one sort of lets the other one bind when it's been pushed twice. I'm definitely noticing harder binds when each of them have been pressed. So I'm just going to go ahead and check what happens when I push both of them twice. So that's 1, 34, 5. And yeah, lock opens. So that's it. Our combination is, we'll just cross that all out. And we can read all across the lock, so no 5s, no 4s. All right, 3. So our first combination is, our first number is 1. Then we have 34 and 5. So that's our combination. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on the fact that 2 isn't in the combination at all. We had no real indication of that. Sometimes that happens. You don't really have any guarantees with this attack. It's sort of just a random assortment of how finger lengths match up to the code wheels. So here we didn't get any hard binds or anything like that. I know I talked a lot about them, but there just weren't any. Sometimes you'll run into a combination that uses all the digits. So there's a lot of situations you can run into. You can definitely try to feel out these sort of binds in other ways, sort of indirectly, but ultimately the best way to tell when a button isn't in the combination is to either feel for the hard bind or just to find the combination.